something that would handle this variety of points of views, yet still distinguish it from the alternatives. Then, in addition, Marty and I would have the specific work of finding a label for our own specific point of view, which is one among many. I guess we'll just have to go back to the drawing boards. You want to comment or no?
I'm going to not to abuse the chair's privilege or get involved in too much discussion. Yes, go ahead.
I was hoping you'd comment, but I did want to get into the discussion. I want to press one of Angie's points, and before I do, I should preface what I'm saying by saying that geographically, for the last 7 years, I've lived in the state of Kansas. Now, you may know that due to certain aspects of the state constitution and in the state of Kansas, that this whole issue is near and dear and very much discussed. And we've gone back and forth with our state board about whether we should treat creationism and intelligent design as a part of the scientific curriculum for the schools. I haven't been to San Diego and talked to Gish, but I have talked to a lot of people in Kansas. And it seems to me that the point that that Antje makes on page 8 is the key problem for evolution and why so many Christians find creation science or intelligent design attractive. She says, while the matrix of atheism and materialism is certainly present, the core of the perceived problem with the theory of evolution seems to be a humanism rather than a theism. It is not so much the loss of the godness of God than the loss of the humanness of humans that concerns many of those who feel the attraction toward creation science or intelligent design. It is the dethronement of humans rather than the God question that shakes people up. In your paper on page 13, you have this wonderful little diagram about all the layers of ideology, and I think all of those are important. But I think that it misses the key problem, which is what Antje said in this. It's not an ideological concern, it's a theological concern. And if I could, I want to just frame it crassly and see how you respond to it. If you're a Christian and you take seriously Genesis 1, where humans are created in the image of God, and you're told that humans have evolved from monkeys, well then where is it in that evolution process that the image of God comes into play?
Can I take some time to think about that?
Take all the time you want, but I'm desperate for an answer because Sunday I have to go back to Kansas.
Let's collect a couple of other questions. We have Bob next.
On this one, they all raised their hand.
Oh, Bill, this is within that. Phil and...
Yeah, I would just come back and say, I think some of the anxiety, this is to your paper too, which was a brilliant paper. I wouldn't want to distinguish clearly between the loss of God and the loss of the human. I think there's an intuition that if we lose God, we will lose what it means to be human. And it was Michel Foucault who first pointed that out in The Order of Things, that when God was dethroned or forgotten or cast away in Western culture, that the human as a concept was also lost, or man, which is probably a better term because the human was conceived as a male probably. So I wouldn't want to distinguish those so closely. And here's the second point. When I talk to people who are concerned with this kind of thing, it reminds me of a prayer meeting I went to, where people who are very committed to prayer in my church talked about miracles. And they said, you know, what happened was my friend had cancer. There was, you know, in all the things the physicians could see, there was cancer all over this part of the person's body, so the brain. But we prayed, and then there was no cancer. And the physician said, the day before the surgery, we got to stop the operation because I can't explain it, but the cancer's gone. And everybody responded by saying, that's amazing, God is at work, right? And so I think my first point is, let's not distinguish ahumanism from atheism so closely. But the second point is, I think we have really a problem with sustaining this primary-secondary causation. I wouldn't be what's the word? Quick to get away from God as a cause. Because what people want in that prayer meeting is they want to see a bald assertion of God's causation. And I think what they want to see in ID is just all of a sudden it's all ripped off and God caused this thing. So when you talk about where is the transition to the image of God, people who are in this camp, and for whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, I know many of them, they want to say, here's God's fingerprint right there. None of this obscuring because human beings or natural processes were involved. So I guess I want to support the title of Theistic and Theistic evolution, because I think those are still critical concerns. One, if we lose theistic, we may lose human at the same time. And secondly, we need to help people have a richer understanding of what God's causation is like.
Bill, you wanted to comment? Phil?
I said I'll pass.
You'll pass. Ted, are you ready to respond? Did you want some time? Are you ready to
I can respond to Greg, it's easier. I think you're right with regard to the people in your church hungering to see God as part of the nexus of secondary causation. Marty and I have not talked much about miracles, so I think we think the following. You know, Marty and I have 4 ears and 2 mouths, but one mind. That the position that we're taking, that we used to call theistic evolution until 20 minutes ago, deals with God's general providence and God's general relationship to the world as creator. And we think that for the sake of scientific research, we're not going to talk about miracles as being unusual divine interventions into the causal nexus. That doesn't mean that miracles might not happen or that miracles might not exist. It's just not part of scientific research when you're dealing with something like biological evolution. And it's very possible that even if a miracle were to be looked at it, you wouldn't see it. I mean, David Hume kind of pointed that out, that you're not going to see it given the methods. So a theistic evolution position would not necessarily make a decision for or against the presence of miracles. It would simply say that when you're doing research on the history of biology, you're not going to see them.
Another way of saying that, if I can just interject to agree with Ted, is science, as it's constituted methodologically, is opaque to miracles. That does not argue that miracles do not happen. It simply argues that, as Ted said, science cannot see them. Bob.
Very sort of small point, really. It's on page 3. To thank you for this. Let me just say, as a first remark, though, kind of joke, I used to refer to this position as evolutionary theism until Nancy Murphy finally called me on it and said, "You mean God is evolving?" So I got my metaphor wrong. The chapter's a lie. On page 3, you refer to other positions. Materialism is one, ontological naturalism is another, methodological naturalism is yet another. I'm confused. I would have said methodological naturalism is presupposed by science. So science is a form of methodological naturalism. It's not an interpretation of science. Whereas ontological naturalism or materialism are interpretations of science. So that sentence is confusing to me.
Yeah, I can see why.
Okay.
Alice, he's next.
Thank you for your paper. I wonder though whether it's really the loss of the human that's at stake or the justification of the human in this sense. One of the issues I think that the folks like Dembski, the creation fellows I think are really dancing around is the question of suffering. And the question of theodicy, the justification of God, a good and powerful God that allows evil things to happen, that's changed a lot since the Holocaust. It's what Marilyn McCord has called horrendous evils. And since then we have seen a kind of horrendous evils, not only the Holocaust, but Bosnia, 9/11, you name it. And what that has done is shift the question, at least a lot of us are thinking, from having to justify God, but to justify our own humanity. Okay, is the human worth, is humanity worth being human? Can the human really be justified? Can the human creature be justified, given that it seems like the human is responsible for these horrendous evils? The technical term, I guess, would be anthropodicee, if you like terms, you know. But I'm not so sure that it's the loss of the human, but the justification of it that's at stake here. If we cannot even give an account of a human, as Professor Barbour said, the human uniqueness, evolution seems to take that away from us. And so we have no way to, no account of the human that can justify our creatureliness. I wonder if that's not part of that.
Next was Antonio.
I was wondering on the mention of the eventicity. God is an event with an eventicity that allows originating causes. In a sense, but my question is really about the energy. So the first question, does God then reserve his energies, or all his creation based on he's using all the energy to create this universe and us? So I think that there is the theistic term confuses a little bit, because it does get you to think that God is expending all his energies in creating his universe and creating us. Why should we be so arrogant to say that when we really God is omnipotent? We have to say maybe he reserves some energies at other levels. Let's put it in the physical world. I just made that comment. If you like to.
Did you want to respond?
Because it goes in agreement with what he is saying.
Yeah, if I can respond, I would like to respond to a couple of these questions together. And one point I wanted to make is I sure do think that, both to you and to Alex, that there is a relationship between the loss of God, the godless of God, and the humanness of humans. I overdid it sort of in my paper just to help us get the dialogue from 19th century to the 21st century. Because I think that the theism conversation, theism, atheism, is basically the conversation of the end of the 19th century. And I think that that's where those who coined it originally actually are.
That's right.
And by first moving it back and saying, no, you really are concerned about humans losing their humanness by being taken to be apes. sort of thing. Let's get that done, and then we can do the next step and say, yeah, really, we should approach the question of the loss of human uniqueness in terms of a, what do you say, anthropocracy. That needs to be part of it. Yeah, the two are interrelated. And the other point I wanted to make is that part of what, and there I see a connection between Phil's paper and my paper. I think a point we are wanting to make is be cautious not to put all your eggs in the basket of cataphatic theology. We also need to try to express in intelligible and reasonable ways this apophatic tradition of theology and kind of spell out what that might be and bring it to the table and not be afraid of doing that.
Is this on this point, Bob, or?
It's a little bit different.
Okay, then let's go in order to James.
Thank you, Arthur, for your paper. I'm very grateful for what I think is a salutary reminder that causation is not necessarily the most important category for an adequate understanding of God. And nevertheless, I wonder whether the causative implications of theism that you identified in your paper don't serve a useful kind of heuristic value. If we have the conviction, on the one hand, that evolution proceeds more or less as present-day science accounts for it, and on the other hand, the conviction that God is in some sense, however complex, the cause, does this not force us to work on richer accounts of causation? I mean, at this conference, we've seen Marty recovering essentially a Thomistic distinction between primary and secondary cause. We've heard talking about an eschatological sense of causation in prolepsis. Think of Whitehead and Hartshorne trying to recover a full fourfold account of cause, even though they adopted an extremely non-Aristotelian metaphysic. Cannot those two convictions, that evolution proceeds causally and that God is in some sense cause, force us to reconsider, and you put it in your paper that our accounts of cause in these discussions tend to be simplistic. Don't they force us to move from that oversimplification? Let me ask the more open question. If this discussion were to move into a more satisfactory discussion of causality in respect of evolution, what might that look like? What would you want to see accounted for?
That needs a lot of thought. My starting point, because would be it's happening in, with, and under natural processes.
So naturalism would be a part of.
At least the methodological naturalism. Yeah, last night I was at Ted's home and looked at the rug you have there with the Egyptian goddess Nut.
Yes.
And it struck me that this image of being stretched over is a nice metaphor for what we are trying, I think, as theologians in religion and science dialogue. Obviously, we have our feet in theology, but we're also trying to stretch over as far as we can and to grasp both literally and metaphorically this what science gives us and make sense of that and metabolize it if that's not going too far with Newt.
Tom, yeah, something on
this point about theism and causation. It seems to me, Dante, that you're right about sort of the intellectual pedigree of talk about theism, that it's an artifact of essentially the 18th century, where philosophy disentangled itself from the religious traditions. And then we ended up with this abstract notion of theism set over against atheism. In fact, people tend not to be theists. They tend to be, Lutherans and Methodists and Roman Catholics and Orthodox or conservative Jews and so on. That is, they tend to belong to some particular religious tradition rather than having a generic religious identity. So on those grounds, I think you're right. But on theism and causation, those forms of theology which provide a paradigm for a certain kind of philosophical theism, say the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, is very careful to indicate that the language of causation is inadequate to the reality of God's relation to the world. And in fact, it's their opening move to insist that God's relation to the world is a relation of giving being to the world. Whereas all of us operating here on the level of secondary causation, what we do is cause changes in other things. But God's creative act is not simply to cause a change, it is to cause being. And that's not a kind of causation which we ever exercise or which we can grasp. So the first and central move, it seems to me, is precisely to explode the idea that causation language, when used of God, can be anything other than an analogy that has to be severely qualified by precisely an apophatic recognition of our inability to grasp the nature of God as the source of being. So I just want to make sure that justice is done to that very rich way of speaking. It's not about mechanical causation. In fact, it's on your side in that dispute. It's exploding this idea of any kind of simple causal relation between God and the world.
We are approaching the break time, and I've got Mark, Walter, Bob, Phil, and Ted would like a minute to address Richard's Imago Dei question. So Bob, you pass, and
I'll pass too.
Mark, you'll pass. Walter, did you want to?
I have a short comment on nomenclature that may also relate to Greg's comment. For less philosophical reasons than Angie presented, I don't like the term theistic evolution, having been called that many times by people who wanted to denigrate my position. It's really that I would say very much like creation science, I object to it because it takes one specifically scientific term and ties it to one specifically religious term. And that, I think that automatically oversimplifies what it takes to put the two together. And with reference to Greg's comment, here we have people who pray. Instead of using that simple phrase, I've over many years said, when people say, well, what are you, what do you think, and so forth, I'd say, well, I'm a Christian who takes evolution seriously and a scientist who takes creation seriously. Now, I imagine it boils down to what you guys are calling yourselves, but the fact that it takes longer is a good thing. It causes people to stop a little bit, and then just that word seriously, that's broad enough that they have to think, well, do you believe it or not? That that brings it up, and I think that recognition of the complexity in being both, having more than one way to look at the world, which is pretty much the way I do things, maybe you could almost say, rather than the CTNS way of putting them together in a philosophy. I think these things are put together in a person. I think in a living person who has, let's say, two good creation stories instead of one. We have the biblical story, which has it's a perfectly good story for its purposes, and we have a scientific story, which is also a perfectly good story, but for much less useful purposes. I mean, much less or more specific purposes. If you're trying to tell your kids about life, a story that starts right off with why they're here and God has made them and so forth makes a lot more sense than one that starts off, well, 10 to the 15th years ago, and then you've got all this stuff, and you don't even get to people until the last page. You know, it's not a very good people story, but it's good for scientists and technologists and other people, and for if you need explanations of those details, that's okay. It's a good story, and I honor you for saying we need both stories. But in trying to, it sounds to me like you're trying to put it together in one story, and I think maybe that doesn't do justice to either story. I don't mind the scientific story being very depressing. You know, it doesn't. If you look at it that way, you know, people die and so forth, and all these things about misery and so on. It doesn't make a very good religion. It's you're less tempted to make a religion out of scientism if it is that barren. But you can take it seriously for the purpose that it's good for. But we Christians know better. We know we have another story.
Let's let Ted, if he would, finish up before our break with your comments about Richard's question and any of the others that we've lost.
I've been thinking about Richard's question, and it seems to me that working on the answer would have to go down two paths. One would be the intellectual question the theologian wants to know, and then the other one is the cultural impact of what you're going to say theologically. Yesterday, Marty and I cited the December issue of Science, in which the fertility of evolutionary theory was touted. And one of the examples was comparing the genomes of the chimpanzee and the human being, and the remarkable overlap. I don't remember the figures, but less than 1% of the genes were different between the chimp and the human, and slightly larger percentage of the non-coding DNA. But there were also examples of non-coding DNA sequences that were the same in both the human and the chimp. So, wow, gosh, gee whiz, look at the continuity between the human and the non-human here. Now, intellectually, this is going to have value for medical research because there are some diseases chimps don't get that we get. Alzheimer's, if I remember right, was on the list. And so you can imagine the medical geneticist relishing the continuity, because look at the fertile research programs they've got coming down the pipe. I can imagine an eco-ethicist also liking this, because if we can emphasize the continuity between the human being and the non-human world, then you can overcome the dominion problem, or at least you will have an argument to overcome the dominion problem that you had brought up earlier. So that's the side of the continuity between the human and the non-human. Theologically, I go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, where God takes the clay and molds it and then breathes in the divine breath, and we get the nefesh hayah, the living being. And actually the language of Genesis 2 shows continuity between the human and the other animate things more than discontinuity. But nevertheless, we find ourselves as human beings slung between heaven and earth. I call it soil and spirit, that particular tension. When I think of, well, John Paul II, Benedict the 16th are going to go right to say, well, you know what happens, in each one of us individually, God creates a special soul, and no scientist can show how that happens, only the philosopher can do that. Well, that sort of solves it. But if that's not your philosophy, I think we could say something like this, that really what makes us special is our relationship with God. And that model there in chapter 2, verse 7, being this combination of soil and spirit, it's a relationship. And some good things have been said about relationalist theology earlier. And I guess it might be nice, Phil had given us the word paradox, maybe in the setting of Kansas, you could hold up both the continuity of the human with the rest of the world as well as the special relationship that we have with God. Does not give us permission to lord it over nature, but we can't deny that the human being has got this special relationship with God. Now that needs to be affirmed, at least at some symbolic level. That's only a weak answer to your very strong question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted, and let's thank and for 15 minutes.
Oh, I think you are, but I you know what? I'm not remembering. I'm not remembering. Sorry. Oh, you can listen. No, yeah, listen.
Darren, can you hear me?
Okay, our next paper is Bob Russell. Let me just alert everybody, we're about 6 minutes behind schedule, which is actually pretty good, but we're going to try, if we can, to keep to the conclusion. So Bob, you've got 15 minutes.
Thanks, Ted. And thank you and Marty for your paper and your books and the stimulation you've given us to think about these issues. I want to just step back a second. I'm going to follow my paper fairly closely just to lead you through it quickly, but I want to step back a second and remind us of the broader context. Yeah, maybe this isn't on.
Oh, that's only for recording purposes.
Oh, I see. Sorry. In that case, I will project as though I were preaching.
Preach on.
Preach on, brother. Okay, choir, take it. You know, I came in the 60s to seminary. The issue then wasn't theistic evolution. The issue was, is there any sense at all that God makes a difference in the world? Does God act? The God who acts movement was huge in biblical theology and in systematic theology, but did it really make any sense? And Landon Gilkey in the late 50s published this wonderful paper, The Travail of Biblical Language, in which he said, look, it's oil and water. You talk in the church about God who acts, right? Exodus, redemption, incarnation, but you talk in the world about scientific ontology, and those simply don't fit together. And he really said, we have a crisis of faith. Theology isn't connecting to the world we know we live in. And you can keep those two stories juggling if you want, but when you let go, they fall down, and all the king's persons can't put them together again. So that's the broad context in which this kind of conversation takes place. Theistic evolution is a specific example of the general question of what the heck do we mean about the God who creates and redeems the world, about the God who responds through prayer, about the God who acts in the world, about the God who creates and is the God of this world. And I think that's really the broad context. And as Anju says, the term theistic evolution may completely ignore how huge this issue really is. And that's one of the contexts out of which CTNS was created. So I want to really stress that before we get into any specific proposals about theistic evolution, let alone my own view about quantum mechanics. That's just one suggestion. It may completely fail, but the problem is there for all of us. In fact, the reason why I quoted Monod and Bartholomew on page 3 is because it really shows how deep this question is. Okay, look at Monod. The ancient covenant is in pieces. Humanity at last knows that we are alone in the unfitting immensity of the universe out of which we emerge only by chance. This is very close to the post-Auschwitz literature of the God who's dead, right? In fact, it's almost the same quote. It's almost the same wording, but you're getting it from the sciences, right? Not from Auschwitz. Okay, so I really want to stress how huge that is. And when Bartholomew says in 84, the devastating attack on belief in a purposeful God made by Jacques Monod is the most penetrating and damaging that has been launched in the name of science. And if Monod is correct, it would be sufficient to demolish Christianity and most of the other world religions. Now, whether that's true or not, that's the perception of how deep and broad this issue is. That's the context in which people begin to try to construct some robust view of divine action, however conceived, along Thomistic lines, along process lines, whatever. I mean, there are a variety of approaches, but the general goal is shared. Can we construct an intelligible way to think from our faith that God truly acts in the world in light of what science says, right? And how you philosophically interpret science. That's the broad category. Now, within that comes the specific question of what about evolution? Here's a worked example where it seems to be that we got here by chance, however that means, and so how in the world can we attribute that to God? So, and then within that, there are specific responses. Okay. So I want to simply remind us all that it's a 50-year struggle. In fact, it's a much broader struggle. And however we respond to that, that is the challenges on the books. Okay. Now, the second thing I want to remind us is that the Divine Action series that Deepness and the Vatican Observatory put on was a very broad set of responses to that. We published almost 100 papers. And they all, in some ways or other, got at this kind of general question of the credibility of Christian theology or monotheism in general in light of science. So there are a huge diversity of approaches. And I think that spectrum that Ted and Marty have portrayed is in fact part of an even larger spectrum of approaches, which we'll celebrate in part tomorrow. Now, within that, I think it's important to say, yes, there really is a very specific agenda, that is evolution, precisely because it's been fought over so much. And it's been co-opted so much by militant atheists, right, who say this really proves that Christianity or faith is vacuous. It shouldn't be believed. It's immoral to believe it because it really takes you away from the reality. Wake up and smell the coffee. That was certainly my experience in the physics lab, I think the experience of many scientists. And so I really want to say, let's not confuse the victim and the victimizer, right? It isn't evolutionary science that is the challenge. It's those who co-opt it to take away the right to have faith in a God who acts. Right? And so let's not confuse the two, and let's preserve the victim and attack the challenger as best we can. Now, whether any of our approaches does that justice is an open and crucial question, but I don't want to confuse the inadequacy of our responses with the dire need for a response that's adequate. And if nothing else, my takeaway message is, let's take this challenge on board and continue the process as a team and really try to get a variety of responses to it and not get lost in the details of whether or not process or Thomistic or quantum mechanics or top-down, makes it work best or even at all. Okay? So that's my real bottom line, how really truly urgent this issue is, I think, for faith. Now, in this paper, what I do is say, if you can make a case for non-interventionist divine action at the quantum level, you've got a number of things going. First of all, to use Nancy's wonderful phrase, you've got us beyond this forced option which the mechanistic world gave us. I mean, as she points out, the combination of atomism, determinism in physics, and reductionism in epistemology gives you a mechanistic world in which you either say, yes, God acts, and to heck with science, God intervenes, the conservative approach, or God doesn't really do anything at all, we just sort of name it a pretty rainbow. That's the Schleiermacher liberal approach. If one of these approaches works, and in particular quantum mechanics, then we've got beyond that forced option. And that's also very important for sort of the sociology of theology. Look what's happening. Theologians have their agenda set by another discourse, right? Science says you've got a forced option. I mean, done philosophically and so on, but it's not our agenda. It's an agenda foisted on us. And yet we, in a sense, accept that agenda and then argue conservative versus liberal, right? And I'm saying, wait a second, who's the referee that blew the whistle and said, get out of the pool? I mean, who said, I thought we were playing tennis and they said we're playing badminton? I mean, who changed the game on the biblical tradition such that we're into a forced option? Well, it is a combination of science and it is a combination of a philosophical interpretation of science. But as Nancy has pointed out, and many others have pointed out, if the science has changed, let's not stay fighting the same fire. Only a fool fights in a burning building. Right, we've done that. We've been there. 19th century did it. Half the 20th century did it. Let's move on and look at the new sciences. At the same time, it's a research project. We simply don't know until we've done due diligence whether or not any of the contemporary sciences can be interpreted philosophically in a robust way, which gets us beyond that challenge. So we're still living with an agenda that's not internal to us, right, but yet which we have to face. And that is to get beyond the option, the forced option, or to lose credibility that we say we really mean that God really can act. Okay. So it's a complex problem, right? And it takes sorting through carefully. And what I'm urging is that we separate out the layer of theistic evolution, or the question of God acting in evolution, from the prior and sort of more general question of does God act at all, right? Now, my particular claim is that if you can show God acts at the lowest levels of nature, then you can show it's possible for God to act at every level of nature. That is, every level may be open in some ways, or at least God acting can play out physically without intervening. So the projects of top-down causality, the projects of whole-part causality, I think critically depend on the plausibility of indeterminacy at the bottom level. Now, that's because I'm an incompatibilist. And if you're not, then that's a different story. And as Kirk has said, the three kinds of problems, God world, and human God. So I'm talking about the God world problem. But I am an incompatibilist there. So I need to see indeterminacy at the lowest level for God's action or our action at the higher levels to play out somatically and physically. Okay. And then finally, if you can show that God acts at the lowest levels, the great sort of Lakatosian surplus benefit, the thing you didn't have directly in mind when you made the theory, but which the theory can also account for. So as Nancy says, Lakatos can be used in theological method, actually a theology and science method, is that if you can show divine action at the quantum level, you can also show that theistic evolution or God's action evolution is plausible. So you've constructed a theory in general to get us beyond the liberal conservative divide, to get us beyond mechanistic science into a new area of science that can be interpreted philosophically in terms of ontological indeterminism. And then the benefit is it can be fertile in solving a problem in a related field, that is evolution, right? And it can be beneficial, at least for an incompatibilist, in the mind-brain problem and other problems where, as George Ellis would say, even if we have top-down causality of the mind and the brain has to be open to acting in a new way. Okay. So there are a number of surplus benefits, all of which show it to be, to use Lakatos's phrase, a progressive research program in theology and its engagement with science. Now, the challenges, of course, are multiple. We all know them. First of all, and I only have 2 minutes left to say them, quantum mechanics can be interpreted in multiple ways. And I've got this diagram in the back that shows, 7 or 8 of them. Not only can they not all be right, probably no 2 of them can be right. Probably only 1 is right if any of them are right. In fact, none of them may be right. They may all be telling us something very indirectly about what reality has to be such that it could be multiply interpretable in inconsistent ways. I mean, the really amazing thing about quantum reality might be not that indeterminism a la Heisenberg, right, the realization of Aristotelian potentialities is the right one versus Bohm's quantum potential. What might be really right and mysterious about quantum mechanics is all of them have a piece of the truth in a way which coheres in a way we can't yet see because it coheres at a different level of nature, right? So that to sort of quote Bohr, all we know about reality is it must be such that you would have quantum mechanics, okay? But what it is such that you would have it is probably almost numinous, right? It's that complex. The second thing, of course, is that in the theological domain, it generates the problem of theodicy in a huge way, especially because of the fact that it applies to the universe. Quantum mechanics is a physical theory. It applies from T equals, Planck time forward, right? So it isn't just associated with evolution in suffering and nature. It's associated with the general question of God's action in the world. And in that case, it raises the stakes tremendously, because on the one hand you can say God really is acting in and through the beginning of the universe to the present, but you can also say wherever life has evolved, then you have the question of God acting and the justice of God acting, right? The problem of suffering. And it's even a harder challenge in a sense than the human problem of suffering, because you have the suffering of the truly innocent, right? There isn't free agency, there isn't moral agency involved, so the Augustinian route is almost totally unavailable. You simply have this really challenging problem, particularly if you have a metaphysics which invokes subjectivity at every level, as process does, then you really have to ask, well, then how does one work this question through about God's relation to that? Okay. So what I want to really say at the bottom line is I think the challenge that is posed to us by theistic evolution floats on a broader challenge that's posed to all of us that share the biblical tradition of a God who acts in the first place, given our scientific view of the world. Second of all, this challenge of theistic evolution in particular goes back to Peacock in the 70s in his Bantam lectures, and before that to Barber in his Issues in Science and Religion, where already in Ian's work and Arthur's work, you see them aware of how dire this challenge is and how important it is to meet it. And it really doesn't, I think, have the possibility of a robust response until you can argue for ontological indeterminism. I mean, that's at least my view on it, right? And then I think quantum mechanics can give a reasonably defensible account that it points to ontological indeterminism, but you're faced with the fact that that's one interpretation and then the multiple interpretability problem, okay? So it's a whole assembly of issues that's posed to us. At the same time, it's an incredibly exciting and rich and inviting domain of inquiry because so much is at stake. So much is at stake both for the theological tradition and for the credible voice of the church and culture, in which it seems to be that science simply makes our faith in a God who does respond to prayer incoherent. So thanks.
Floor is open. We'll go with Greg and then Carl. Greg, you're up to bat, and Mark.
Just two questions. I think the first one's for Bob. I presented this idea this week to a group of three of us that talk about philosophy and theology and science. And they were wondering if quantum indeterminacy was the new pineal gland. In other words, remember Descartes, had this part of the body he couldn't describe, couldn't figure out, so that was where the soul was. Is this place in, reality, a place where we can't describe it, therefore it's where God acts? I tried to defend your position, but I want more ammunition when I go back to Chico. The second thing is, more broadly, Darwin, I've observed throughout the papers and the comments that everybody's saying the Odyssey is a terrific problem. It's almost like we've raised it up. It got worse, in this day, It has gotten worse. I think we're identifying something. Yet nobody really yet has taken it head on, as far as I can tell. So maybe I've not seen it in Ted or Marty's work or Bob, what you're saying, but are there any of you that want to answer the question of theodicy from a Christian perspective within an evolutionary framework? Because, as you pointed out when you came to Chico and lectured, that was Darwin's key issue, right? Was theodicy. And that's what turned him to make the resolutions that he did about his theory. So, is there any, first is quantum reality the new pineal gland, and second, can we answer the question of theodicy more broadly?
Bob, do you want to collect some things, or do you want?
You name it.
Okay, let's collect some items. Was this a finger, or was this a whole hand? A hand. Okay. Let's just remember what Greg said. Let's go on to Carl. Excuse me.
Bob, mine is going to be somewhat more of an affirmation. You and I have only once sat down and talked about my issues on measurement and so forth. That was many years ago. What I said earlier about measurement in the second law and the fact that we can't get beyond distribution functions, which I know you understand thoroughly, seems to me to be a very important aspect of this. That's going to hold whether we have quantum theory or even classical physics. We have that problem, which I think leaves an openness at almost any level, regardless of how you look at it. I understand completely, I think, your position on that we need we need down at what John Pokemon would say is, I'm a bottom-up thinker. And we need it down at the very bottom that we can say, aha, there, it's open. And I do think that with the quantum theory, we have that, but we can avoid the fact or the idea that everything just sort of levels out. Well, it doesn't. We have the same measurement problem at the higher levels. It's the ensemble problem. And so I think you're right. I think it exists there. I'm very thankful for the way you outlined how critical this question really is. I think it's sobering. I'm glad you did that.
We'll just take notes, we'll go ahead and collect. Mark, you're next.
Well, my comments were basically where you ended, Carl, and that is, I've always admired the courage that you have had in pushing the importance of this and the depth of your penetration of it. It's, thank you, I think everybody, that's part of my wanting to be here was an honoring of how you've done that for 25 years at the center, and before that, how much it's your vocation. And it's wonderful. My question is along the lines of the quantum indeterminacy, and that is whether we've made any progress in recent years. You and I have had this conversation many times. Whether we've made any progress in recent years of specifically getting from quantum indeterminacy, say you're right about that, to higher levels of organization and what real impact that has. In other words, at the level of complexity where you're talking about intentional action, capacity, the spiritual capacity for relationship with another. In other words, have we made any progress getting from this openness to what it means at a higher level? It really gets to the statement that you made, that if we can find openness here, then we can talk about divine action from a number of places. Well, I'm wondering exactly how this gets filtered such that it makes any sense to talk about intentionality at the human level.
Well, I'm going to go to Adrian and then you again. Is that okay? And then Bob can respond. Adrian?
Do we want to accumulate more at this point?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, a couple of questions on clarification to see if I do understand where we're going. I've only visited Kansas, but I live in Seattle. And so I'm often asked to explain anything I say in terms of intelligent design. And so I'm going to try and relate your proposal, Bob, in relation to intelligent design. First of all, an easy question on pronunciation. It's QM Nyota? QM Nyota, okay, all right. So 2 points of clarification, see if I understand. If we just grant that this is the case, that using Nyota, God has the means to make objective changes in history, specifically biological history. If that's the case, this is something that is pretty friendly to the ID crowd. It is potentially a mechanism by which they can actually get things changed during time. And as an aside, a question, does that lead you then open to Ted and Marty's criticism of ID as describing a nature which is unreliable, especially if you allow for bulk properties to change? I mean, is there some limitation on how much can change just as a result of quantum events? So that point of your proposal seems to me to be ID friendly. And my next, if I understand this correctly, point is where things change. Because I think you would say there is no way to know if God in fact did use these means in biological history. This exactly stops the ID project right there. And then the real question, if we have on the table the means for which by which God can actually make objective changes in biological history, and then through scientific eyes we see no evidence of that, why would we then, as theologically inclined persons, why would we imagine that God did use that mechanism in history when he didn't need to? Statistically, it would have happened over time. And I'm wondering if there is a preference for either, theologically. And my own personal preference is to go with the second, is that nature had that possibility within it, and is ultimately more pleasing to me, and we're going to get into aesthetics here, that the basic structure would bring about, perhaps drawing from Simon Conway Morris, the means that God intended. So, thanks.
Ian?
I wanted to ask I wanted to ask.
You want it completely dark?
I wanted to ask Bob how you would relate your stress on the quantum level action to what a number of other people have been saying about those actions on other levels. Either Marty has been talking about the importance of systems actions in which what goes on at the system affects what goes on at lower levels without violating lower level laws. Peacock talks about top-down causality. Process people also talk about openness at all levels. And you're certainly open to the idea of openness and God's action at different levels, but it seems as if by stressing God's action at the quantum level, you're saying it's basically a kind of bottom-up operation, that what God does down here works its way up, and that therefore there's a kind of a ghost of a reductionism that says you explain everything by what happens at the lowest level. And it may be that you're a physicist, not a biologist, so you want to put the stress on where your expertise and your work is. But it seems to me there's a bit of a ghost of a reductionism that says the most important explanations are what goes on at the lowest level. Whereas I thought Marty was saying, and I would say, and I think Peacock would say, no, what's most important is what goes on at the upper level, and that in turn exerts an influence at lower levels. And there's openness at the upper levels, not just because of the openness at the lower levels, but in itself. And particularly when you get to agency, when you get to intentions, purposes, and at the human level.
Val, would you like to go to bat?
Well, thank you all for these comments. They're great. Greg, is this a new form of the pineal gland? Well, like I said, if atoms may be small, but they're everywhere, so I guess the pineal gland is everywhere in the universe. But seriously, no, it's not at all. It's not a causal joint argument. Quantum mechanics is not somehow a shared domain between God's action and natural action. Quantum mechanics is one place where the effects of God's action shows up. Okay, that's a very important distinction. And it shows up because, I mean, you could say it's intelligible that it shows up if you give it an intrinsic account. So it's a philosophical view of determinism pointing to a level of nature where you can argue for intrinsicism based on science. Right? Now, this goes to Ian's point. I, of course, believe in human agency. I'm a Christian theologian. But the question is, can you find a scientific theory for higher levels of complexity which could be given an ontological intrinsic interpretation? And the answer is no. Unless Polkinghorne finds holistic chaos, you're not going to get it in the weather. You're not going to get it, in physiology. So, unless you can find it there, you can't play the theology science game. I still believe in it. Please, don't get me wrong. But strictly doing theology and science as a method we've worked out for 50 years, you can't ignore the sciences and appeal to a faith in divine causality at every level, even though I believe that happens, unless you can engage the sciences at those levels. So unless quantum mechanics is really unique in that it can be given a very radically different interpretation than the interpretations of the science can be given. Now that's why I would agree with Ian and all of us that Arthur and the rest, that the goal might be to find top-down causality starting at every level of complexity. But whether you can deliver on that depends upon the scientific theory, which is the best theory that accounts for that level. And that's why it's a research program we have to be engaged in. But it turns out that you can do it in quantum mechanics. So it's a very unusual situation. It sounds like there's only a bottom of causality. So my bottom line is I believe in top-down causality. I believe in whole part causality, but I cannot find scientific theories that can be interpreted philosophically to make that cogent. It's a hard answer. And I'm looking for a counterexample. I mean, show me one. And I had this conversation with Arthur, with John for years.
But I think pointing to chaos theory, as we know it now, is a classical indeterminacy. I'll get it.
How about Marty's concern for systems theory?
Systems theory
It's
doesn't help.
too undeveloped, isn't it?
No, it doesn't help. These systems are still classical systems. They aren't indeterministic systems. They're complex systems, right? I mean, I understand from chaos theory that the smallest motion of an electron in Andromeda can change the weather. But it's because they're so deterministic. The butterfly effect presupposes rigid determinism, or you never get amplification of small effects. That's the whole point. John and I have gone around this for years with Nancy. Unless you get holistic chaos, chaos theory is the worst example you can find because it's exactly the triumph of determinism applied to systems which when I was in college, like meteorology, you couldn't tackle because they're too complicated. So this is a hard story. I mean, that's why very few people do theology and science. It doesn't mean I wouldn't be interested in exploring other theories that describe systems theory, systems,